Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Jim Oliver. I'm the provost here at the SPC Seminole campus, and it is my pleasure to extend a cordial welcome to SPC Seminole to all of you this evening. We're pleased to once again host this public affairs forum co-sponsored by SPC's Applied Ethics Institute, the Public Policy and Administration Baccalaureate Program, and the Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions. And if you would please join me in extending our thanks to our media co-sponsors, the Tampa Bay Times and WUSF Public Media. We sincerely are grateful for their support in getting the word out about those forums. Let's give them a round of applause, please. It's great to see so many students in the audience. And we know that many more are watching the live stream video of this lecture in classrooms, coffee shops, and at home. Forums like this one to enrich the classroom experience and to enhance it are precisely what was envisioned when the Ethics and Policy Institutes were created. And it's gratifying to see it put into practice in a beautiful auditorium like this here on campus. We want to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us this evening. We know this is a particularly tough time for students, especially ethics students who are busy writing, getting ready for midterms and other classes, and getting ready for spring break. So thank you especially for being here tonight. I hope all of you realize what a privilege it is to hear from a scholar of Dr. Benjamin Barber's stature. He's internationally known in global circles, and we're honored to host him here at St. Petersburg College. Now to get the program started and to properly introduce our keynote speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Lori King, our professor and instructor in the SPC's Applied Ethics Department. Lori.
Thank you, Dr. Oliver. And I would just like to reiterate thank you for coming tonight. It's wonderful to see you all, and I know how busy everybody is, so thanks for coming. I think it's going to be a really interesting evening. So before we get started with the introductions, I just wanted to let you know the format of the evening is Dr. Barber is going to speak for 45 minutes, 50 minutes or so, and then we're going to have a question and answer period. And we've got cards that you can write your questions down on. So as he's speaking, if you have a question, you want to write a question down, let us know. We'll be circulating, and we'll get you a card, and we'll make sure that he gets the card, and we can kind of have a dialogue after he finishes speaking with all of your questions. And he welcomes all different kinds of questions, so please don't be shy. I think it'll be a very interesting interchange. So to get on with the introduction, I can't tell you how pleased and honored we all are to have Dr. Benjamin Barber here tonight. He is an internationally renowned political theorist. He's the Walt Whitman Professor of Political Science at Rutgers University. He's written 17 books. They include the classic Strong Democracy, the international bestseller, and my personal favorite, Jihad versus McWorld, and Consumed, How Markets Corrupt Children, Infantilize Adults, and Swallow Citizens Whole. He blogs regularly for the Huffington Post and writes for, among others, The Nation, Harper's Magazine, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and The Atlantic Monthly. Dr. Barber holds a certificate from the London School of Economics and Political Science and has an MA and doctorate from Harvard University. He also often appears on television. Some of the programs he's been on include The Travis Smiley Show, CNN, Bill Moyer's Journal, Fox and Friends, The O'Reilly Factor, and Charlie Rose. It is truly a privilege to have Dr. Benjamin Barber here, and please help me welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor King. Thank you also, Provost Oliver, for being here and welcoming me. It's a real pleasure to be in Florida. I try to come every year. Unfortunately, it's February 29th, and that turns out to be every 4 years that I actually get here. It's snowing in New York, where I came from this morning, so you can imagine my pleasure, not just seeing you here and talking with you about some issues we all care about, but also to be down in the wonderful Florida sunshine. So thank you all very much for being here, and I want to thank the Applied Ethics Department and the Strategic Policy Institute, St. Pete's College, and Seminole Campus for making this conversation possible. And I hope it really will be a conversation. One of the things that distresses me, and I hope it distresses you too, is how hard it has become for Americans to talk to one another. We disagree about a lot of things, but that shouldn't mean that we don't talk. On the contrary, it means we should be talking more, and we should be talking to each other with civility. We should be talking to one another with respect and understanding, even where we disagree, as we do, obviously, in many places. For that reason, I see that some red cards have been brought out. I hope some blue cards will be handed out as well, which will allow everybody to express themselves. I want to talk about things that affect us all in the United States and around the world, and it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, it doesn't matter whether you're a liberal or a conservative, because they're issues that affect us all, because we live in one of the world's great democracies where citizenship and citizens are what make it possible for us to live in a free society. And I want to talk tonight with you about changes in the world that are impacting how we understand and how we think about what it means to be a citizen. Not just in terms of a citizen of Tampa or a citizen of Florida or a citizen of the United States, but what does it mean nowadays to be a citizen living in a world which is becoming smaller and smaller? And how does that change how we interact with one another? One of the great contradictions of our country is that we live in what is perhaps the most multicultural country in the world. We look like the world. There are people from every country in the world living here as residents and as citizens. Yet in many ways we are an incredibly parochial country, a country which feels so limited, and you listen on the media, you don't hear about the rest of the world. We talk about our politics, and we don't seem to understand that what happens in Uganda and in Chongqing, China, and in Mumbai, India, and in Singapore and Rio are as important to us as what happens in Tampa or Atlanta or New York. But the media doesn't help us see that. We don't talk about it. Even in our electoral campaigns, not just in the primaries, but in the general election, foreign policy, international affairs really get shoved to the side. We don't talk very much about it. So what I want to do this evening is talk a little bit about how the world has changed in ways that make it impossible and dangerous for us to continue not to talk about and understand our position in an increasingly interdependent world. And that word you're going to hear a lot tonight, interdependence. It's a very important word, right up next to the word we know so well here, independence. 200 years or more ago, one of the great liberal documents, libertarian documents, freedom documents of the world was signed, the Declaration of Independence. And in the Declaration of Independence, a simple formula that has been followed for 200 years was put forward. That formula was that if you want freedom, you want security, you want justice, then you must create your own independent and free nation. Independence is the recipe for freedom. Independence is the recipe for security. And for the last 250 years, right through till now, that continues to be the case, so that countries like Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or Egypt are looking to declare their independence as a way of securing their liberties and justice. Independence is how we think about ourselves, and has been for a long time. But what I want to suggest this evening is that the world has changed in ways that make independence no longer a ticket for liberation, but a kind of prison that prevents us from understanding the world we live in and prevents us from being able to manage our affairs and manage the affairs in the world in a way that allow us to flourish and succeed right here in the United States. For a very long time then, when we talk about democracy and freedom, we talk about independent countries. Switzerland, the United States, Brazil, India. We talk about freedom as a product of that independence. But at least since 1945, since the end of World War II, most people around the world have understood that the world has become so small, so interdependent, so contained, that to think of it in terms of a series of 200 separate, bordered nation states no longer makes sense. We teach civics in our schools. We teach citizenship to young people. But we teach them what it means to be a citizen of Clearwater, of Tampa, of Miami, of South Carolina, of the United States. And yet that's not where our young people live. Sure, they live there. They live in Tampa. They live in Clearwater. But they increasingly live in a world whose resources, economics, diseases affect us every day in ways that are as important to their everyday life as 100 years ago what happened in the local neighborhood was. There has, in other words, been a fundamental change, and I use to capture that change this word interdependence. Nation states are bordered, frontiers. You know that when you come in from Mexico, over from Canada, you fly in from overseas, you come through customs, you enter the United States, you show your passport, you cross a border. And the world has been bordered just in that way for a very long time. But most of the things that are important in this world today pay no attention to borders, have no interest in borders. Let me name some of the things that define the new interdependence in which we live. And ask yourself, are these bordered the way states are, or are these things without borders? Hong Kong flu. When I was young, I grew up in New York, my mother used to worry, she said, don't go over to New Jersey, there's a bad flu over in New Jersey. Stay out of the Bronx. Some trouble there. There's some chicken pox in the Bronx. But we don't worry today about New Jersey viruses. We worry about West Nile virus. We worry about Hong Kong flu. There's a recent film called Contagion, some of you may have seen, where a new germ in Hong Kong within a few weeks has spread around the world by airliners and fast communications and immigrants, so that a contagion that in the 19th century might have taken months or years to begin to spread, in a few weeks has spread around the world. HIV, the terrible scourge that in the 1980s and 90s, before we kind of got control of it, took such a terrible cost in lives in America, wasn't born here. It came from somewhere else. HIV doesn't carry a passport. It doesn't stop at borders. In fact, all of the global pandemics of the modern world are global in character. You can have the best public health system in the world, the way, say, the Swedes do, or the way some of us think we do, some of us think we don't, but it's not a bad public health system. But whether you like it or not, the fact is the American public health system by itself can't do anything to control pandemics that circle the globe in 24 hours. Either you have a public health system that is planetary, a global public health system that keeps everybody safe, or nobody is safe, no matter how good your system is. That's the nature of disease. That's the nature of interdependence. It was 85 today in Tampa, I think. But I haven't heard anyone say, yeah, we have a problem down here of Tampa warming, or Florida warming, or America warming. We've got global warming. The atmosphere, the ecology of our planet is closely tied together. And what happens here is directly impacted what is happening in Canada, what's happening in China. The United States and China together are responsible for something like 40% of the emissions, CO2 emissions in the world. So even if tomorrow we became really good about driving electric vehicles and not having these emissions, we wouldn't solve the problem, because we would still have Chinese emissions and Indian emissions. And if they solve their problem, they'd have to deal with our emissions. Climate change, global pollution, those are issues that are not touched by national borders. The great sovereign United States, and it's a wonderful country and a powerful country, but powerful and sovereign as it is, can't do anything about climate change, can't do anything about these global pandemics on its own. It can only do it cooperatively. We do these things together or they don't get done. Some Americans tend to disparage people outside the world, others like people around the world. But I'm not talking about whether you like or don't like them, whether you think they're a bunch of foreigners and don't want to talk about them or not. I'm talking about the fact that we can't live without cooperating with them and finding ways to work with them. That's simply a reality. That's a fact. That's a necessity. It doesn't change how you might feel about them, but that's not the point. The point is the world is such that disease and climate cannot be controlled one country at a time. Or take markets, economic markets. Even in the 19th century, 18th century Adam Smith, 19th century Marx, were writing about the global character of markets. Our corporations today are multinational corporations. They may have a base in one country, an accountant in another, factories in 35 others, but they are genuinely multicultural. I hear people saying, and I understand it, drive American, buy American cars like the Chevy, except the Chevy is made mostly in Mexico and Canada with 75% parts from elsewhere in the world. And Japanese cars, like Toyota, are made largely in the United States with quite a lot of American parts. So which is the American car? The Toyota, made in the States, or the Chevy, made in Mexico? How do you drive American? You don't. There is no automobile today that has Japanese or French or American blood in its metals and in its engine. Cars, like so many other goods, are the result of global manufacture markets that move around. And we know that companies that are unhappy with the price of labor here, or with safety standards, or with other things, they can pick up and move, and there's not a thing the powerful United States government can do about it. They pick up and go somewhere else where the labor is cheaper, where there are no safety standards, maybe where 12-year-old kids are used to manufacture things, because they don't have child labor laws in some countries. And again, I'm not trying to say that's good or bad. I'm simply saying that the United States, if it has important standards that control the use of children in manufacture or control the environmental effects, is no longer in a position to be able to actually make a difference and control those things, because companies can go where they want and take the jobs with them, and they go to the countries where this works. So markets in capital, markets in labor, markets in commodities are global. Or take the banking crisis that we went through, all of us, in 2008, we're still trying to recover from. That wasn't an American banking crisis, but it wasn't an English banking crisis either, or a German banking crisis. Financial markets are global. The banks are all interconnected. Some folks in Florida took mortgages they couldn't quite afford, and when the rates popped up, they defaulted on those mortgages. Meanwhile, the mortgages they had taken had been sold and resold to secondary markets and eventually to tertiary markets in places overseas. And when the thing came apart in 2008, what happened is that default mortgages in Florida in effect helped create a global disintegration of the economic system. And as a result, we all suffered from a breakdown of banks across borders. And the attempt by the United States, you may agree with it or not agree with it, to re-regulate, Dodd-Frank bill and so on, can only be successful to the extent it touches American banks, but it's not going to affect Chinese banks. It's not going to affect Indian banks. It's not going to affect Japanese banks. And English regulations, the English were rather tougher on their banks, but that's just in England. But the banks are global. The laws and regulations are national. That asymmetry means that it's very hard for individual nations to control a global financial crisis of the kind we just had. Or take the terrible example of 9/11. For 300 years, war meant one state declared war on another state. The armies of those states met and clashed by night, and somebody prevailed. World War II was like that. But what happened on 9/11? Who exactly attacked the United States? That was the first question George Bush and his cabinet had to ask. And being good American old-fashioned statesmen, they said, well, which country attacked us? Because when there's a war, it's a country that's attacked us. Said, well, it must be Afghanistan because Al-Qaeda trained with the Taliban in Afghanistan, so we'll declare war on Afghanistan. And we did, and we're still there, actually. One of the reasons we're still there is that the people we went looking for, Al-Qaeda, actually, the minute we got there, left. They went over to Pakistan, down to Sudan, some went to Syria, some went to Indonesia. So then we said, well, that didn't work. Let's attack Iraq. Maybe we can get them at Iraq. There wasn't a lot of evidence that, in fact, Iraq and that Hussein had supported Al-Qaeda, but nonetheless, we went there. Well, again, we're still there. That's not working out so well, but, things are a little quieter, and Hussein's gone, and that's good. But Al-Qaeda is not gone. And I'll tell you why. Al-Qaeda is what I call a malevolent and malicious non-governmental organization. It's an NGO, just like Doctors Without Borders is. But it's a vicious one. But it knows no country. It is not a nation. George Bush went looking, understandably, for a nation to pay the penalty for attacking us, but we were attacked by a malevolent NGO that has no more allegiance to any particular nation than multinational corporations do. It's a global entity that moves around from one country to another, but it knows no allegiance. So we were using a national army and a national air force to make war on what was in fact a slippery international NGO. And it's still out there, and it's still working. And you can't even find the center of it. We got Osama bin Laden finally, and that's great, but there are a million little pieces all over the place. And there are a million small Osama bin Ladens. How does a nation state defeat in war a slippery, non-governmental organization that knows allegiance to no country and that there's no address to go to? In the old days, even where there were people making war you didn't quite recognize, you say, yep, they have an address. We know where to go. The Taliban, if the Taliban are responsible, go to Afghanistan. That's where the Taliban are. But can someone give me the address of Al-Qaeda? Osama bin Laden found his way into a particular house. That had an address, but that wasn't the address of Al-Qaeda. So again, it's much harder today to figure out who the enemies are. And it's not just Al-Qaeda. There are dozens and dozens of terrorist organizations, including Hamas, including Hezbollah in Lebanon. But what's their address exactly? For a long time, Syria was seen as the promoter of Hezbollah, but recently Hezbollah says, we don't like Assad, we don't like the Syrian regime, it's beating up its own people. So we can no longer go to Syria, to Damascus, and say, now you better get Hezbollah under control. So we live again in a world that isn't so simple as World War I and World War II. World War I, World War II, we knew who the villains were, we knew who the bad countries were. We declared war, our allies were with us, the Axis powers were against us. Germany, Japan, Italy, fascist Italy, Spain, and then there was Britain, France, and then the Soviet Union and us as allies together against them. That was all very clear, state against state. And when the peace finally came and the victory came, the victorious states came together with those who had lost, and we signed the peace treaties. And everything was very clear. And then we could go about the business of rehabilitating and recreating a new, more democratic Germany and Italy and Japan. We all know that history. But there's no parallel to that in the world today, because most of our enemies are not per se states, but these terrorist organizations that are everywhere. So 9/11 was a kind of brutal tutorial in interdependence, and not a happy kind of interdependence, a brutal interdependence. The reality that borders don't count. And even, by the way, think about it. If you try to say, yeah, but we know who the 19 guys were, where had they been? Where did the 19 people who did 9/11 come from? New Jersey, Florida, New York. They've been living here, almost all of them, for a couple of years. I was teaching at Rutgers then, and 2 or 3 of them had come from New Jersey. I got nervous because President Bush said, any state that has even inadvertently hosted and put up with Al-Qaeda is the enemy of the United States and will be punished. And I thought, well, New Jersey had 3 of them. We're in trouble now. And, it sounds silly, but that's the reality. The reality is the attack came from the inside, not the outside, because they had slipped across our borders and they weren't coming from somewhere else. There was no address. Their address was New Jersey or Buffalo or Miami. And again, that's a different world. It's a very, we read our history books and we look at the world, and we know the War of 1812 was the USA and England. And we know what happened in the war with Vietnam. And we know about the Iraq War even today. But those aren't the wars that are really troubling. The wars that trouble us are these new asymmetrical wars in which borders don't count. And national identities don't make the difference. Who are the nationals? What is the national identity of Al-Qaeda members? You name it. 20, 30, 40 countries. They come from all over the place. And they don't associate themselves with the countries they come from, but with the ideology of the organization to which they belong. And that's a new and puzzling kettle of a fish for the Pentagon and for the CIA and for the President of the United States to figure out, because that's not the way we used to do business. Or take a somewhat more positive thing to talk about interdependence. Think about the new technologies. How many of you are on the web here, one way or another? Raise your hand. Are you on the Tampa web or the Clearwater web? Or is it the Florida web you're on? The World Wide Web. It's the World Wide Web. You can't even tell where the sites are. They don't put up signposts. They don't have addresses either. Nobody knows exactly where they are, because we have a global technology. Digital technology is global, both in the manufacture of the hardware, in the platforms, but most importantly in the communications. When you go on the web, you can talk to almost any other person in the world, any other organization in the world. Some are malevolent and terrible, some are very nice, but you certainly don't go and put, I want to talk to only websites in the USA or in France. That's not how it works. That's not how it's carved up. National borders are not how we define the web. Our technologies, and young people, I think, are very cognizant of that. It's even true of culture. The bands that are important, the entertainers and so on. Many different places. They no longer fall neatly into, are they American, are they Mexican, are they Brazilian, are they English? We've known at least since the 50s and 60s, American blues and American rock and roll have become global, and such that, to our amazement, the most successful rock bands of the 60s and 70s were not American, but English. Because that's because music's become global also. culture has become global. And again, most young artists don't talk a lot about the nations they come from. The other night, anyone watch the Oscars? Fewer people are watching it, but if you watch the Oscars, which film won Best Picture, Best Actor? It was French. L'Artiste, that great Hollywood thriller, L'Artiste. By the way, in fact, it was made in Hollywood, despite the fact it was made by French. So even that's confusing. You know, this French film made in Hollywood by French people, but don't worry that it's in French because, in fact, it's not in French because, in fact, it's a silent film. And very few Americans have actually seen it, but it won the award. And again, it tells you something about our culture. Or the film, one of the best foreign film was won by a film called Separation. It was an Iranian film. But I guarantee you, if you watched it, you would think you could be watching a French or a German or an American film. It was about a divorce, a difficult divorce. It was about a family quarrel. And it was a kind of universal film, and nobody would think, oh, where's Ahmadinejad? You know, where's Khomeini? Where are these terrible Iranian people who are making atomic bombs, supposedly? Look closely, and all the borders that we talk about and that our national passports identify vanish. And that is the kind of world we are living in. To put it simply, to sum it up, we live in a world where every challenge we face and almost every opportunity we face is interdependent and global in character, whether it's disease or technology or economic or markets or climate or weapons or war. Every one of those challenges crosses borders and is interdependent. And how do we respond to these new, difficult, interdependent challenges of the 21st century as democratic citizens? With 18th century sovereign state institutions created for a very different world, where you deal one slice of territory, one people at a time, with problems that don't recognize territory or people. And then we wonder why we can't solve so many of our problems, why countries can't agree on climate change, where they can't even agree on how to combat terrorism, where they can't agree on technical standards, where they can't agree on how to regulate international banks and global corporations. We have global problems, but national solutions. We have international challenges, but nation-state responses. And now come to our theme of citizens. We talk about democracy, we talk about citizens, we talk about Americans, we talk about the French citizen, we talk about the Chinese citizen. We still slice ourselves up as citizens into the democratic entities associated with nation-states for the last 200 years. And we have a media, and not just in America, but in most countries, which focuses just on that. And we have a politics that actually insults those politicians who try to recognize people beyond borders. The U.S. Supreme Court has said, we shouldn't pay any attention to international law. This is America. And there was a time when that might have made sense. But in a world as interconnected as we are, to ignore international law on the American Supreme Court just doesn't make sense. We have a media that devotes 99% of its time to national, state, and local affairs. When is the last time you saw, never mind on your local news, but even on NBC or CBS or even CNN, a story? You'll see a story about Iraq and Afghanistan because Americans are dying there. But when did you last see a serious story about Somalia, about Uganda, about what's happening with climate in the Himalayas, with how Singapore has a housing policy that subsidizes, for 80% of the population, ownership of their apartments? Anyone read about that? We hear things like they're all socialists over there, or those are foreigners. We Americans don't have to care about that. And never mind that that's a little silly, but the point is it also means that we will not understand what is going on in the world we live in and with the forces that affect us. We're turning our back not on the world, we're turning our back on our own destinies, on our own ability to control things. The first thing you need to make a difference is to understand the environment you live in. And if the environment is global, your understanding better be global. If your environment is global, your media better pay some attention to it. And we just don't do that. And it's not just us. You go to Switzerland, it's most of the Swiss news is mostly about what's happening in Zurich and Geneva. Go to China. Same thing, most of the news is about China. It's natural. We want to kind of concentrate on the communities we live in and are part of. That makes sense. I get that. But the trouble is it doesn't describe the world we live in. So the media give back to us a picture of the world that is really a distortion of the things that are affecting us. And then we have a politics in which if somebody speaks French, like John Kerry, or Romney, they have to conceal it. God forbid, you should let Americans know that you speak a foreign language. You might think they'd say, wow, that means you might know something about another culture and you can read their newspapers, and we need an American leader, whether it's a conservative or a liberal, who understands the world. But to speak a language for a politician is a liability. How can that be? And to me, it just makes no sense. Not because I'm saying it's so wonderful to have a fluent cultural knowledge, but because for America to survive and thrive, we have to understand this interdependent world in which we live and know how to work with and cooperate with other people. If all of the challenges are global and all of the realities and the media and the politics are local and domestic and bordered, then we have a powerful and difficult asymmetry. And in that asymmetry between our challenges and our responses is really the source of most of America's problems today, I believe. Because we still think we can do it alone. This is a great country. I love this country, but when our politicians keep screaming, we're number one, we're the greatest country in the world, the problem of that is that even the greatest country in the world has to live in a world with a lot of other pretty great countries, and pretty bad countries, and to do that means you have to cooperate and work with them. And waving your own flag and saying we're number one, and we don't have to deal with anyone else, we don't have to talk to anyone else, is destructive to America. Not to the world, to America. Because we cannot succeed for all of our power and our virtuous history and our very many strengths without understanding and cooperating with others. And that brings me back to the issue of citizenship and how we teach citizenship and what it means to be a citizen today. Because most young people, when they're not utterly cynical about citizenship, because they're very unhappy with the way that money and politics have gotten all messed up and the way politicians don't talk to one another and the incivility of our politics, but even if they believe in citizenship here at home, they never get an opportunity to think about what it might mean to be a citizen of an interdependent world. And if I were to begin to focus on what we need to do to create a nation of citizens who are good Americans, good Floridians, good New Yorkers, good Californians, good Georgians, but also capable of being good citizens of an interdependent planet, then the first thing I would do is make sure that civics had a global component in it, and that when you teach citizenship, whether it's in primary, secondary, high school, community college, university, you name it, that you think about what it means to be a citizen of an interdependent planet, as well as what it means to be a citizen of Tampa. It's great. A lot of schools and colleges, particularly community colleges, focus a lot on community service, and I think that's great. And people who go to school understand they owe things as citizens to their local communities, which support them. But what about a form of community service? That's what the Peace Corps was, that does some service to the world, allows people to go abroad and see the needs for service, and allows others from abroad to come here and do service, because we have plenty of problems too. And we can use the service of young people from other places in the areas where we have problems and don't always deal with them. Service, community service, can be not just international and global, but it can be a two-way street. You can have exchanges. Wouldn't it be amazing to have some young Chinese citizens coming to the United States and working on problems in some of our ghettos, problems where we have some of our ecological dead spots, brown areas. Having them work here as our young people would be going to Suzhou, Chongqing in China and doing service there. They would begin to get the sense, first of all, that the problems we have are not so different than we think they are. That we share the same problems, that these global realities of an interdependent climate and interdependent economics and so on mean that we can work on them in many places at the same time. Citizens have to begin to understand that their citizenship has to be local and national, but also global. And the first place you do that, of course, is in the schools. The programs here, the ethics program here and the strategic studies program here, I know have a sense of that global focus, but those are rare. Most political science departments, even political science departments, which ought to know best, are divided up into American politics, constitutional law, local and municipal politics, and then over here in the corner, international affairs. You know, as if that's something sort of separate, and you don't have to do it, but if you want to look at it, or comparative politics, you can actually study a few other countries. Don't have to. A political science department that doesn't recognize interdependence? But unfortunately, political science is often, I'm one of them, is often the last to recognize the real political changes in the world that we have to deal with. So education is crucial in citizen training, and that means that citizenship has to be understood as something that takes us across borders and allows us to see the world beyond. We need political leaders who talk about it, but right now they get punished. I mentioned before that if you speak a foreign language as a politician, you have to conceal that. And rather than enjoying and reveling in the fact that we are a country now which has a large contingent of people who speak Spanish as their first language, rather than saying, that's fine, English is the primary language and Spanish is a secondary language, and wouldn't it be great if every American learned both well? Rather than saying, everybody learn English and people who speak Spanish, well, that's too bad, get rid of it. Because the reality is, both of those languages exist, both of those languages are windows on vibrant cultures, and they both deserve to be part of, and are, I mean, it's not they deserve to, they're part of America. So accept that. Make that part of the education. In Switzerland, everybody speaks at least 3 languages, because French, German, and Italian are national languages, and you sort of have to speak those 3 to get along. In Belgium, people mostly speak Flemish and French. In Canada, French and English. And that's a great thing, because it's a multicultural world, and the more languages you know, the more you have a sense of that world. Which is the reason why so many of our international students here in the United States make such great contributions, because they have to speak English, they're going to school here, but they bring with them at least one, in many cases more languages and cultures with them. So they understand it. But our politicians get punished for it. When President Obama was first elected, he gave 2 quite remarkable speeches, one in Istanbul and one in Cairo. And in both of those speeches, he spoke about the interdependence of the world, the need to cooperate. When he came home, people in his own party said, don't talk that way, you're going to get in trouble. People will think you're somehow anti-American because you're willing to talk about what's going on in Cairo and in Turkey. And in the last couple of years, he stopped talking that way, although he still gets assailed for it in the media, for being too sensitive to other countries, as if being sensitive to other countries meant you didn't like America or you were betraying America. The only way a politician can betray this country is to refuse to recognize the rest of the world. That's a betrayal of America, because it means you betray our capacity to live in and succeed in a global world by pulling down those blinders, pulling down those walls. So another thing as citizens we all need to do as global citizens is to reward politicians who want to think in a more multicultural and cosmopolitan and interdependent way. To say that other countries count and we have to work with other countries isn't to say that we're no good, we're inferior. To cooperate with others doesn't mean to rank them. When husbands and wives and children talk together, it doesn't mean they're saying, oh, I'm putting myself down because I talk with my wife, or because we listen to our children, we're not taking ourselves seriously as parents anymore. Collaboration and cooperation raise the dignity of everyone involved. An America that talks to the world is a more dignified and powerful America that actually has more influence. America has been most influential in the world when it talks to others, interacts with others, and cooperates with others. And when it isolates itself, it says, never mind, we're the best, we're number one, we're not going to talk to anyone else, we don't need anyone else, it loses the respect of the world and finds it's less able to succeed in the things that it wants to do in the world. This country itself ought to know that, because we are already becoming a country that looks so much like the world. You know, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, you know what America looked like? Look at me. White, middle-aged, Protestant. And that was kind of America. But today, America under 16 is already a majority of minorities. It's not white, it's certainly not just male. Our country today is a beautiful tapestry of the world. And that ought to make us a nation best able to understand and work with the world, because it looks just like us. And yet, ironically, we somehow act like we're still 150 years ago, and we're not like that. And we draw a picture of ourselves that doesn't represent the world. Now, for some people, I know it frightens them. I understand that. If you've lived safely in a community that's mainly white, mainly Christian, it's a little scary to look out there and say, whoa, this country's changed from my grandmother's world. And naturally, we all get uncomfortable with people who look different. But if you go and talk to Americans, whether they're African Americans, Chinese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Latinos, you find, in fact, they enjoy the same things. They're differentiated by politics just the way the rest of us are. You find, in fact, they are Americans. But they're a special kind of American because they're Americans who feel and look like the rest of the world and are capable of interacting with the world. One of the reasons American business does so well in the world is that it is multicultural. And the American businessmen who go overseas of all colors and all backgrounds have an ability to work that way. The Chinese and Japanese have had a fairly difficult time working abroad because they come from monocultures, and they're very ill at ease. We worry about the Chinese investments in Africa, but the Chinese have been, this is the second time they've come there. The first time they came there, they were so insensitive to the realities of African culture that they failed and they were thrown out. Now they're back, they're trying to be more sensitive. But it comes easily and naturally to Americans because we are the world in the very best sense. But it's like we don't want to recognize and use that as a strength. We want to hide it as a weakness. And that's so silly. Sometime in the next 30 years, this country will be not a majority white Christian country anymore, but a great tapestry, a majority of minorities. There will be no majority. There'll be a white minority, a Latino minority, an African American minority, an Asian minority. And that's terrific. That will make us a very strong country. And by the way, if you look at some of the once strong countries of the world, like Italy and Spain, their mortality rate has gone down, but in fact their birth rate is so far down, their populations are shrinking. America's population continues to grow. Why? Immigration. Because we welcome people from all over. And they reproduce quickly. And that gives us a great new vital strength. That's always been the strength of America. But somehow today, one of our problems is immigration has always been our strength, but each wave of immigrants comes in and says, okay, we can close the door now. So when the Irish and the Italians came at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, they became, and back then there were a lot of Protestant Anglo-Americans who said, oh, we can't have those Catholics coming in. Those people from Southern Europe. They're too different. They won't fit. But they came, and then there was waves of Jewish immigration. And now we have new waves of Latino immigration and Asian immigration, and they give us great, robust strength. But again, it's Italians and Jews and Latinos and Catholics who are saying, oh, well, I don't know if that's going to work. I don't know if we can absorb them. It's the strength, not the weakness of America, that we have these waves of immigration, that we are a genuinely multicultural country. And I know, again, it's much easier to be with people just like you. It's also boring, unproductive, and a sure way to kind of give up. And by mixing with people who in some ways are very different, but in many ways are very much the same because we share a common culture, we share a common economy, we share common interests, are very much like us. It's a great way to continue to grow and to become part of this interdependent world and to succeed in it. So citizenship needs to be interdependent and global citizenship. Democracy needs to be global democracy, not just American democracy. We need to understand our multiculturalism as a strength, not a weakness. To understand that our differences make us strong and it's okay to have them. And very often you'll find that the people who seem most different actually share some things. Maybe in our discussion we can talk about a little bit the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. That in some ways, and in other ways they share many of the same senses that power has become too concentrated, the bureaucracies have become too large, and power has been taken away from ordinary Americans. So that people who seem very different are not really so different. But we need to understand that our country is both like the world, in the world, needs to cooperate with the world, and we need citizens capable of doing that, because democracy is only as good as its citizens. In a tyranny, you better have a good tyrant, because he calls all the shots. In a democracy, your country is as good as your citizens. And if the citizens get it right, they'll find the right leaders. And if they don't, I don't care who the leaders are. They won't be able to succeed. It's time we stop blaming the politicians, blaming Washington, blaming Wall Street, blaming the corporate elites, and say, this is a democracy and it's up to us. And if we are active and engaged citizens and do our job, and do it in the spirit of a multicultural, cooperative, interdependent nation, then I think this country can be as great as the political rhetoric pretends it is when it isn't. And I think our citizenship will become once again the foundation for a truly democratic country, but also for a truly democratic world. It really is up not to others, not the politicians, not who wins the Republican primary, not whether Obama's elected or not. It really is up to us. And it's time that as citizens we take that responsibility back on ourselves. And that means acknowledging one another. It means talking to one another. It means respecting one another. It means, if you're pro-life, understanding that there are powerful and important arguments women have to make about the control over their own bodies. But it also means, if you are pro-choice, to understand that for many, life does begin at conception, and that's important, and it's not a good position against a bad position. It's two important values that are not easily compatible with one another. And to talk about it that way, talk about our toughest problems in a language that allows us to respect one another and understand where we're coming from. That's what makes democracy work. Democracy will never be better than its citizens. America will never be a really successful democracy till it has successful citizens, and we will never live in a world of interdependence that America can succeed in unless it has interdependent citizens. So my message tonight is then just remembering these two simple facts. Democracy comes back to its citizens, not its leaders. That's us. And that as citizens we have to recognize the new interdependence of the world and make that our reality and find a way for America and for us to succeed in that world, not in spite of that world or against that world. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. These are going to be some questions. Let me just quick look, and I'll try to group them a little bit. Annette Graham, do you think there'll ever be a harmonious relationship between all or most countries? What negative effects will a positive relationship create? That's good. What negative effects will positive? So can we have something like global peace and so on? The reason for optimism is that interdependence means we have to have global relations with other countries to succeed in dealing with our problems. The Chinese have a different system. They're not very much like us. But on the other hand, if the Chinese don't get hold of climate control and we don't get hold of climate control, we're both going to suffer together for it. The Iranians want to make an atomic bomb. The Israelis feel very threatened by that. But we know that an atomic war in the Middle East will serve neither Israel nor Iran. So that logic means there are alternatives, and we've got to find those alternatives. Negative effects of a positive relationship, the only negative effects is that people who speak only one language and think that foreigners are strangers and we shouldn't talk to them, they're not going to be very happy. But that's okay with me. I mean, I think they can be unhappy for a while until they learn that, in fact, they will benefit by those relationships. Is America a special country as people think it is? There's this wonderful term, American exceptionalism. We are the great exception. We're different than every other country. Well, the first thing you should know is that I can probably name about 25 countries that say exactly that about themselves. The Swiss have the thing they say, Sonderfall Schweiz, special case Switzerland. It's a special case. It's unique. It's different. The British Empire and the British have always believed they're special. The French talk about la mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission of France. It's there to civilize the rest of the world. And that was true back in the 18th century. They were thinking about how they would civilize the Russian czars and Russia back in that. Most countries, the Chinese word for foreigner is barbarian. Because they've been here for 5,000 years, they're the oldest civilization, and they think the rest of the world is young and barbarian. So most countries, it's built into the idea of nationality, think they're special. And by the way, I think that's okay because I think most countries are special. And certainly we're very special. And it's a very unique and special countries. And part of what makes us exceptional and special is that other than the Native Americans who were already here, who unfortunately we largely destroyed, and African Americans who were brought here in slavery, everybody else in this country came from somewhere else voluntarily. And that's what kind of makes it an amazing place. It gives us special problems and special afflictions because that everybody's here voluntarily except those who are the children of slaves. Obviously makes it very, very difficult for those who come from the slave heritage. But still, a country made up of people who have all come from somewhere else, that's fabulous. And that does make us special. Not because we're better or superior, but because we have a capacity to understand and be part of the world. So I think pride in ourselves, pride in who we are is great. But unfortunately, the way it's used by a lot of politicians is a kind of club. We're special, we're better, other people better listen to us, they better do it our way, they better obey us. And that's just the way it is. So American exceptionalism as a kind of pride in our uniqueness and an understanding that other countries are unique in their own ways, that's great. And again, it's like a family. I mean, you have children. If one of your sons says, "Am I special, Daddy?" Of course you're special. You're much better than your sisters and your brothers. You never had that to it. Say, you're special, but little Susie's very special too in a different way. The way we handle exceptionalism, and every one of our children is exceptional. Everyone in our family is exceptional. That doesn't mean they're better than somebody else. And the trouble is in America, the language of exceptionalism has become a way of putting other people down, saying we're better, we're superior. That's very dangerous. That can lead to jingoism and nationalism and willingness to think that other people aren't really very important. So yes, I like American exceptionalism. I like thinking about each country in terms of the unique contributions, and I think we have very special contributions to make as Americans, but that doesn't make us better than other people or give us a right to lord it over them or to ignore them either. what can we do here in St. Petersburg to make a difference? Well, that's a really good question, because I know, I can imagine one can sit and say, well, what he's saying makes sense, but so what am I supposed to do? I'm going to go home to Clearwater. I'm going to go down to the peninsula. I'm going to go over to Tampa, and now what? What's different? Well, it comes to two things. One is that you are a citizen. And what you say and how you vote and what you allow your politicians to say and do does count, because you control them. There's a great story about President Roosevelt in the 1930s. After he was elected, Philip Randolph, the first African-American president of a union, it was the Pullman's Union, went to the White House and said, "We supported you, Mr. President, and now you have welched on every promise you've made. You haven't done a darn thing. You've left us out here. You're not doing anything." And President Roosevelt turned to Philip Randolph and said, "You know what, Mr. Randolph? That's your fault, not mine." I said, "What do you mean?" He said to them, "Mr. Randolph, it's up to you. Make me do it. It's up to you. You're the citizen. You have the votes. Make me do what you want me to do. It's your responsibility, not mine. If I'm not doing it, that's because other people are putting more pressure on it and making it easier." I get tired of citizens who, I'm a liberal from New York, but I get tired of people who put down the Tea Party. The Tea Party is a group of Americans who cared about things and got in there and fought for their beliefs and got politicians to say, if you say to them, if you don't listen, we're not going to vote. Well, if you don't agree with the Tea Party, then make them do it. If you're in St. Petersburg and care about globalization and about internationalism and about multiculturalism, then speak out in ways that your neighbors and your political leaders see and hear it. And make sure that people who talk in the other language get punished. One reason there's still a lot of racial bigotry around is that it's interesting, because officially everyone knows racial bigotry isn't allowed. But a lot of us tolerate it. Privately, we're embarrassed. We don't want to, somebody says something, makes a joke privately in the locker room. You say, well, okay. We put up with it. If you tolerate it, if you put up with it, you encourage it. So what you do, how you come down on people who speak a language that you think is unfair or injudicious, how you respond to politicians, it makes a difference. How you behave makes a difference. So take these things that we've been talking about today home. Tell the local media, tell the local TV you want a little more reporting about what's happening outside of the United States. Go to the channels that do it. There are channels that do it better than others. Again, the power does come back to you. If you lived in the Soviet Union 50 years ago, if you lived in China today, it would be a great question. What are we supposed to do? But we live in a democracy, which means that you do have probably a lot more power than you realize. The people who use that power find that they make a difference. I'm going to come to some of them. Let me try to go through a couple of these. I don't want to just do it in the order. There's Occupy Wall Street. There's what is the art of common space about? Let's see what these, some all really good questions. Bill O'Reilly, that goes with ideological politics, political awareness, golden rule, Muslim culture, that's a good one. We should say some words about that. All right, let me take a couple of these. Let me start with the one about Muslim culture. In the 1940s, of course, thinking about Oriental culture, Asian culture, Japanese culture, we were at war with Japan. It was very easy to see the Japanese as our enemies. During the war in Vietnam and Korea, it was still, the focus was out there. With 9/11, for a lot of Americans, Muslims became a problem. Never mind that there are 5 or 6 million Muslims living in the United States, almost all middle class, successful business people, very much a part of the American community, who had nothing to do with that. There were people, and some of them are my colleagues, who have written that Islamic culture, Muslim culture, is incapable of being democratic. It's a warlike religion. Well, my experience of the world is I've never known a religion except Buddhism that doesn't have war also in its veins, along with a lot of other things. If you lived in the Middle East, what we call the Middle East and Palestine, say in the 12th century, the 13th century, and were asked who was the warlike culture, you'd probably say not Islam but Christianity, since Christian knights had traveled 1,000 miles to take the land of the Muslims away from them. The Crusades were a warlike thing. The Inquisition, not very pretty. The war of Catholics and Protestants in the 16th, 17th century, not very pretty. Same thing with Islam. Islam was born in a warrior Middle Eastern class of Arabs, a lot of wars, and there's a lot of that in their blood. But at the same time, while we were doing the Crusades, Islam had a renaissance of humanistic culture. In other words, Islam is just like every other religion. It has a strong, positive, ecumenical, loving side, and it has an insular, angry, we're better than others side. That goes with the territory. Those of us who are religious, I think, work hard to try to bring out the part of our religion that's in the gospel that is about love, that is about ecumenical cooperation, that is about we are all children of God. And that's present in Islam, in Judaism, in Christianity, and certainly in Buddhism and Hinduism too. But in each of those religions, there's the other side. The Hindus, who we sometimes think are more peaceful in the 1970s and 80s and early 90s, had a nationalistic military wing in India that did some real damage to Indian democracy. So yes, is Islam capable of ideological turns that make it dangerous? Yes, just like Christianity is. Just like Hinduism is, just like Judaism can be. But is it a uniquely inhospitable religion that is intolerant, that is warlike? Certainly not. And again, understanding and reading will make that clear to anyone. And the great thing is, and I give President Bush a lot of credit after 9/11, he said very early and very powerfully, he said, our enemy is not Islam or Muslims. That's not what this is about. And that was a wonderful thing for him to say, and it made a big difference, I think, in the American reaction inside. So Islam is just another example of the other. When we don't know them, they are the other. We fear them. We characterize them. But Islam is simply one of the great Western monotheistic religions, and a very good one, too. Wow, we got so many here. I should read more and say less. That would be good. So let me read some of the questions so you know what you're all thinking about, even if I don't try to answer them all. Would teaching the Golden Rule be helpful to people both to understand and act interdependently? I'll ask you that. Think about that. It sounds to me like it might be a good idea. I like the Golden Rule. It makes us say, think about in doing to others how you'd like done to yourself. That's not a bad formula. It looks a little like, for those of you who studied philosophy, Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. That's the same kind of thing. Make the law of what you do the law for all people. Make what you say should apply to you apply to others. So yeah, I think the Golden Rule it's been there for a long time, and it's not an accident that it's been one of the rules that's there in most of the great religions and great philosophers. So it's a good one. How do we cooperate in a global world with people who don't share a global vision? It's a great question, and that's what a lot of people are asking about the United States. I travel a lot around the world, and a lot of people say, we love the United States, but we also know it's a very great and powerful country. We also know the world can't make it without America. But how do we deal with a country that seems so turned in and so insular and talking about its own self and talking about its interests and saying we can do it alone and we don't need the world? So it's very hard, but this is a place where we ought to think about that in terms of ourselves. Imagine, if you live in Colombia or in Canada, nearby, or in the Caribbean, or in Europe, and you see a country whose politicians on both sides of the aisle so often act as if the rest of the world doesn't matter and doesn't exist. We are the example of the country that it's hard to get on with in a world where you have to cooperate. And maybe the best way to figure out how to answer that question is to make ourselves more sensitive to that world and more capable of working to that world. What did I talk about with Bill O'Reilly and Fox News? Well, the thing about being with Bill O'Reilly is you don't have to worry about talking too much. There's not a whole lot of time to talk. Because he does most of the talking, and he's a pretty clever guy. My experience is, though, I do a fair amount. I'm going to be on the Stossel show this weekend, John Stossel's economic show. I do Fox News a fair amount, and I like it because just like some of the conservatives who go on MSNBC with Rachel Maddow, actually it's a much more interesting discussion than hearing people just patting themselves on the back and saying, I really agree with myself, and I think what I said is really smart just now, which is what happens on both those networks, right? Fox does it from one point of view, MSNBC does it on the other, and we are so in need of dialogue. And I appreciate when I get invited on because, they're willing to say, all right, let's have a guy with a different point of view come on and talk, and you got to hold your own, and it sometimes gets a little tough, and Bill O'Reilly will certainly give you a hard time. But by the same token, you do have an opportunity to both on the air there and in the audience to speak to people who come from a somewhat different position than you do. And that comes back to this question. I wish Fox and MSNBC would merge and have a series of programs in which they had to talk to one another so that Bill O'Reilly and Rachel Maddow could, have a go with one another. And Hannity, could talk to Joe and, I know, I get that, but he's there. A lot of people listen and care about what he says, and we need to, and he might learn something from them, and we might learn why so many Americans think that Hannity, speaks a language that they represent. And that's we have to be careful because there's a lady in the first row who's saying, yes, that's great. Oh, Hannity, no, I draw the line there. And some people on the other side would say, yeah, I'll listen to liberals, but that Rachel Maddow, she is so strong. Oh my God, and she's gay as well. And we're not going to. That's where I draw the line. We can't draw those lines any more than we can in our own family. Because in our own family, it turns out someone's transgendered, someone's gay, someone's a bigot, someone's married someone we can't stand from the wrong religion. But we have to make it work, and America's a family, and the world is a family, and we have to work with one another that way. So, I'm a liberal. Listening to Hannity doesn't make me feel good, no more than you, but I know one has to address the things he says. And I know, for example, that it's not a good thing that those of us who are critical of some of America sometimes get mad at people who wave the flag. But, it's our flag. It's a flag for all of us. It's not the conservatives' flag or the liberals' flag. It's all of our flag. During the 1960s, I was a pretty radical kid, and I was against the war in Vietnam, but I got very angry at my fellow protesters when they burned the American flag. Don't burn that flag. That's my flag. That's our flag. And the right of dissent and the right of protest is built into what the flag stands for. So hold the flag around you. Hold it up high. It's your flag too. And I like it when some conservatives, and they do say, I really don't agree with you, but the great thing about this country is that you and I can argue about these things in a way that some other countries can't be done. And that comes to this question of, when does ideology become so severe that you stop talking to people? Well, here's the thing. When you stop talking to people, when you stop using your mouth, there's only one other way to deal with them. And we know where that leads. And democracy, it would be easy if democracy was about talking to people just like us. Same religion, same values, same sex. Fine. But democracy wouldn't be needed for that. You don't need democracy if people agree with you on everything. You just get along. Democracy is for people who don't agree with one another. Sometimes in very fundamental ways, on very fundamental values. And the great thing that everyone in a democracy does is say, mad as I get, much as I hate your guts, I'm not going to punch you in the face. I'm going to use my words. We say it to our children. Use your words. You know, when they're flailing at each other. I want to say to our politicians and our media people, use your words. That doesn't mean insult each other. It means use your words, use your reasons, use your arguments. That's what you have to do. And that comes back to the question of civility. And there's a relationship between citizenship and civility and civil society. Citizens have to be civil to one another. Why? Not because they agree, but because citizens disagree, and they disagree fundamentally. And civility is what allows them to try to work it out. We don't have to agree with one another, we have to live with one another. And to live with one another, rather than to kill one another, we have to find ways to adjudicate our differences, put up with them, tolerate them. And most importantly, and here's a question here about common ground and common space, we have to find common ground with them. And that's why one of the projects I'm doing right now is trying to find some common ground with Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. And there's a couple questions about Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street is about mostly young, not just young, but mostly young people who have gotten so disdainful about a politics that they don't believe in democracy anymore because they think democracy is all about the taint of money. And super PACs and big money and government is just another expression of the marketplace and the banks. The banks have bought the politicians who have allowed themselves to be bought and done the will of the banks. The oil, energy industry has bought the government does its thing. The other night, I think 2 nights ago, or maybe it was last night, Santorum and Romney were talking about the XL pipeline and saying Romney was saying and Santorum was saying the president has stopped the pipeline. The sad thing is the president hasn't stopped the pipeline. The pipeline, it will probably go forward with the president's complicity because on both sides of the aisle, the oil industry is very important. And Occupy Wall Street has basically said, never mind these specific issues, we can't have a system in which money and politics are the same thing. We've got to separate those out. When I talk to people from the Tea Party, many of them say some of the same things. They say great big companies, a great big government influenced by big money is doing things that have nothing to do with the things we care about. And a lot of them are, and they're very different. There are many other differences, but they agree together that big gargantuan corporations and banks and big gargantuan bureaucratic government and big politicians taking that big money are no longer doing the things that as citizens we care about and need. And a lot of Americans feel that way on both sides of the aisle, and that's good, and we ought to be talking with one another about those things and finding common ground. And that's the key to democracy. It's not, you can't just put up with differences. It can't just be about tolerating people you hate. It's got to be about finding common ground, finding the things that we can share, finding the issues on which, okay, I think I see where you're coming. What if we do it this way? And by the way, one of the things, if you follow the Supreme Court at all, if you follow Justice Kennedy, he's been a swing vote. And it's been very interesting what he does because people don't realize the court's actually very political, not in the ideological sense that it's doing the bidding of big powers, but in the sense that if you're on the court, you have to deal with the justices on both sides of the issues. And in many cases, Justice Kennedy has been a great example of what I think is a civil and civility-oriented compromiser who has tried to find common ground. So, for example, on the issue, very tender issue for all of us, of what you do about teenagers who are pregnant, do they have to get the permission of their parents to get abortions? Some people say, of course they do. You can't do that to a family. You can't separate a child and allow them to do something without their parents knowing. Others saying, yes, but what if the parent's abusing and what if it's the father who got them pregnant? Well, Kennedy, if you look back at the case where the Supreme Court ruled, found a way between, he said, well, I think, 18's too old, 14's too young. Let's find an age where you have to report, but let's find a way to report indirectly to family rather than directly. And he tried to find common ground. A way that people who were concerned about the right of parents got some satisfaction, but that people were concerned about the right of a pregnant teenager who could be abused and hurt if the family found out. And he found a way that created common ground. He actually got the court, both sides of the court, to come to a 9-0 decision. That's what our political discourse needs to be like. And the only dangerous thing in our discourse is politicians who think it's all or nothing. Because it can't be that. Then you can't have a democracy. If you say my way or the highway, you do it my way, or I'm going to vote you out, you do it exactly what I want, it can't work. We know that's true in families. We know that's true when we talk in friends. We know that's true if you're on a corporate board or you're on a PTA. You've got to find the middle way. Okay, you feel really strongly. Okay, I think you're wrong here, but what if we did this and this? Would you take that? Well, how about this with that? Okay, great. Let's do that. Compromise is not selling out. Compromise is how we survive our differences. And if people forget that democratic politics is about the necessity of compromise, of finding some common ground that we can both stand on for a little bit and say, okay, that much we can do together, then democracy won't work. And the dangerous thing about those in our system today, whether they're on the right or the left, who think that compromise is not an option or that compromise is selling out, is that they don't understand democracy. And we will lose it if they don't understand it. You want some historical examples, go back to Germany in the 1920s, in the Weimar Republic, the communists and the fascists, the new Nazis, each thought there was no room for compromise. It was all their principles, and between them, they destroyed German democracy and set Germany on the road to World War II and Nazism and the Holocaust, because they refused common ground. And if you saw that Senator Snow from Maine just said she's not going to run next year Republican. She said she just can't stand the way in which nobody looks for common ground anymore. Nobody tries to talk across the aisle, and she just couldn't face another 6 years of that, and she's stepping down. And when politicians leave the Senate because they don't believe there's any possibility of common ground, then our democracy is in trouble. But it's our fault because we allow people to get elected who talk that way. You know, again, the ones who are that way, you know, we have to make, we don't like the way they're doing, make them do it. Say, if you're not willing to compromise, we don't want you representing us. Of course, we want you to go and speak for what we believe. But we understand to get any bit of what we believe and survive as a democracy, you have to listen to the other side and you have to make some compromises and find some common ground. And that's how the politics works. Or otherwise, none of us, left or right, are going to get our way. We're going to all go down because we'll be paralyzed and nothing will happen. And the world will pass us by. So ideological politics is fine, but common ground is an absolute necessity. One of the problems with this system, by the way, is that in a good, normal give and take, when you ask the question, you all get a chance to hear somebody else's voice. But now I read the question, I answer the question, I ask the question, and so on. And therefore, I'm going to take the last 10, 15 minutes that we have and allow you to ask your questions yourself from there. I know that's not normally the way, but if you can just stand up and speak fairly loudly, I will try to repeat your question, but why don't we have a chance for your voices to be heard literally? And let's just, that way people will have a chance to hear something besides my voice and to hear the actual voices of others in the audience. That's great. Please. Thank you.
Yes, I just would like to say that I open my home to foreign exchange students, and I have some from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Korea, and I think it's great. I learn their customs, values, their beliefs, and I really enjoy having them there. And I think it's doing, you know, they're way ahead of us because they're coming over here and they're learning English, and they're learning our ways and the ways for them to better their life.
That's great. You answered two questions. You answered the question if somebody said, what should we do? Well, there's one thing one can do directly. But the other thing it speaks to is this country has been terrific because so many people have come from other places. And you know, so many of the greatest Americans are, you know, less than a generation away, including the new basketball player in New York, Mr. Lin, who you all know about, who's doing so well for all the poor Knicks that were doing very badly before that. So that's a great way. That's a great way to do it. But it also speaks to one of the problems we have. right now the Patriot Act and our fear of the other and our fear of immigration has meant that fewer students are coming. And students who used to come from Saudi Arabia or from China or India are now going to England or Germany or other places, and that's our loss. And again, we've allowed our fear, after 9/11, of maybe somehow a spy will sneak in or maybe a terrorist will sneak in, to cut way back on this wonderful wave of people coming to study and learn in America, people that you put up in your home. And I think, again, we want to be able to tell Washington that we don't want fear of the other and fear of terrorism to shrink America and close it off from those who have made it so rich and have given us so much, and so many of the inventions, and so much of the heroism, and so much of the entertainment, and so on we have. So that's a great story you tell, and a nice reminder of something people can do.
Bob Huddick from Seminole. Yeah, finding common ground is great, but it's an uneven ground now with the corporate interest. The corporations are allowed to fund political process, no holds barred. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower warned us of the military-industrial complex. I mean, is maybe getting public-funded elections, would that be part of the solution? You know, everybody's labeling one another, no one's talking to one another. What is the solution? Because everybody's backed into corners.
Well, it's a great question. There is this danger of a closed circle. Money influences politics. Politics makes the law. It allows more money to influence more politics, and we feel more and more closed out and more that our voice doesn't count because the voice is amplified by money. There's a constitutional problem, but we've got to find a political solution. The constitutional problem is twofold. You may remember back in the 1970s, there was, I think, the most important decision. We all talk about Citizens United, which says that corporations are people and they can give all the money they want. But there was a much more important and, I think, unfortunate decision made back in the 1970s in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo. In Buckley versus Vallejo, a quite liberal court said money is speech. And once they said money is speech, they said, therefore, you can spend as much money you want as in your own campaign because it's a form of self-expression. If you stop people from spending money, you're closing their mouth. And you know, there's a certain logic, that makes a certain sense, but it failed to really understand the origins of the First Amendment and freedom of speech, because the whole point of freedom of speech is to equalize speech. Every voice should be heard. And the problem is money skews speech. It unbalances speech. $100 is not the same as 100 words. $1,000 is not. It unequalizes, it disequalizes the playing field. So that first decision that said money is speech is the first problem. And then, of course, Citizens United said, well, if money is speech and corporations are people, then if you stop them from spending their money, you're inhibiting their freedom. It just follows. Those two decisions together have caused this flood of money. But we're probably not going to anytime soon change those constitutional decisions. So your question is, what do you do about it? And there's several things. I have a very simple solution, and this can be accomplished legislatively. The airwaves, the broadcast media, the digital media are public goods and public utilities. Back in 1934, the first Federal Communications Act said radio and later television are public utilities. They're owned by the whole American people. The government then, in its wisdom, leased out the airwaves for a price to various private corporations. But in theory, the airwaves are still owned by us. But here's what happens in elections. In elections, we find ourselves having to buy back our airwaves, our television airwaves and radio airwaves, for advertising during that period. Well, I have a simple solution. We own the airways. Why do we have to buy them back? 70% of what's spent on elections, these billions spent on elections, goes to buying radio and television time. During elections, we should repossess, for a brief time, the airwaves that belong to us and give them to people who are in the race for free. That will equalize the playing field, will make money much, the money, as I say, what money, we know that, you've seen it in the Republican primary. Gingrich gets a billionaire, he gets some time, Romney has a lot of money, he gets some time. Ron Santorum has had a tough time because he hasn't had a lot of money, but he's getting more money, so he buys more time. It's all about your airtime. But why should it be a competition for who can buy more time? There are airwaves. Take them back, use them during the elections. That's what every other, in England, you don't have, there's very little money spent in England or France on elections, because the public airwaves are open to the candidates, and they belong to us. And that doesn't require a constitutional decision of the Supreme Court. That requires only a legislative act. Now you might say, how are you going to get a legislature to do that when it's bought by and paid for by that money? And that is the hard part. But that's why I say, yeah, but they may pay to buy votes, but whose votes are they buying? Yours and mine. And if we don't sell those votes and say, sorry, my vote's not for sale, I'm going to vote for people who in time will overturn that and allow the airwaves to be used for free, we can do that. We have to persuade our fellow citizens to do it. We need a movement to do it, but we can do that. So that is one simple solution. The second solution I heard put forward recently was the solution that you simply create a federal law that anyone who buys time on the airwaves has to buy the same amount of time for their opponent. They can spend $1 billion, but give your opponent $1 billion. Well, yeah, that was the fair. Yeah, that was, you know, that's gone. No, but this is different. This is allowing people to buy time, but saying, but when you buy time, you have to buy equal time. The equal time said the station had to give equal time. This is saying the candidate has to provide equal time. So the more you spend, the more your opponent has. Gingrich wants to shoot down Romney by, you know, getting a super PAC to give all that money. He has to give the same amount of money to Romney. Romney wants to shoot down Ron Paul. He has to give Ron Paul the same amount of money. You know, that's another way. So again, we can be, as citizens, inventive. Figure out ways to make the system work again if it's not working. But if we don't, I think your question is spot on. You know, otherwise we have a system where citizens are sort of closed out because there's too much big money, big corporate money, big rich people involved in this thing. And by the way, you notice how many millionaires tend to now run for and win office, whether it's Bloomberg or Romney or other people, because it's relatively difficult if you don't have very much money to do it. But what some candidates have proved, Ron Paul has proved it, Obama proved it, Howard Dean proved it, is that you can also raise an awful lot of money in little bits on the new digital media, on the web. So there are also ways to counteract big money by getting a lot of little money. They say, I mean, Ron Paul's, I agree with him in some things, I don't agree with him in others, but I love the fact that he has run a campaign based on getting a lot of people to, you know, give enough that he can stay in the race. And Obama originally did a lot. I was very disappointed when I'm a Democrat, but when Obama said, I'm going to buy into super PACs too, I thought that was too bad because super PACs are part of the problem and his refusal to do that. But in the end, he said, I don't think, you know, if they're all doing it and I don't do it, I'm lost. So I don't think that was true. My own feeling was he could have taken that and said, I'm not doing it, but then I need ordinary Americans to make up the difference. But in any case, we do have options. That's a closed, vicious circle, but there are always ways out of the vicious circle that as citizens we have.
Hi, my name is Christian Lemus. I'm an early college student from Tarpon Springs. Throughout our nation's history, as you pointed out, we have a really funny way of dealing with the world. Early 1900s, we did promote the League of Nations, yet the isolationist of Congress did not allow us to be a part of it. Now I'm driving to see you, and I have to pay $3.75 a barrel for gas that we react out of not only the Arab Spring, but with Iran, yet we get this much oil from Iran. So my question to you is, I think in your book, Jihad versus McWorld, you kind of demonstrate our democracy, at least, and our struggle against not only Eastern ways, but unchecked capitalism. How would you describe our funny way of dealing with the world? Is it a bit of a love-hate relationship? Is it a twisted compromise? Or is it a bit of a hypocrisy?
You just described it very well. I'd say that was I mean, in a way, I won't, because part of the answer is, well, let me start over again and give this lecture again, because what I was trying to do in, you know, my talk this evening is to describe the strange ironies. But the most, I mean, you point to the, and there are, yes, it's love and hate, and it's contradictions, and it's the fact that all of America comes from somewhere else, and yet we're so hostile to the somewhere else's we all came from. You know, all of that seems odd. But the real point is, and this is, I think, the essential point of my talk, that it's not about whether it's good or bad or whether it's weird or perverse or proper that we feel the way we do, but that it is deeply counterproductive to the interests of this country. That's the real point. My message is a realist, not an idealist message. In fact, I like to say that George Bush, after 9/11, was the last of the American idealists. He actually believed that America could go it alone, do it alone. Those Democrats and Republicans who are isolationists and say, leave the world alone, we can make it, they're idealists. It's beautiful. They're saying this country all by itself can solve all its problems. The realists say, sorry, wish you could, but you can't. You're going to have to work with others. You're going to have to reach out. So, whether it's perverse or odd or contradictory, doesn't matter. The fact is, unless we find ways to work with the world and across borders and interdependently, we're going to get in more and more trouble. I mean, this stuff even about, I know it's now being pitched a little bit. My wife is very active in the environmental movement and has been working there. And one of the arguments that happens there is, we know environmentally we need alternative energy. We shouldn't be using fracking to get natural gas because that's deadly to the environment. But a lot of people are saying quite reasonably, yeah, but we've got to get off of foreign oil, because that leads to wars and that makes us dependent. Let's be independent. We've got all this oil here, and by the way, we have an awful lot of coal here too that hasn't been used, and that's dirty as hell, but still, why not use it? And so we're pitching these two things against one another. Either you can have a good, clean environment and be dependent on all sorts of stuff overseas and innovation, or we can tap all that coal and natural gas at whatever environmental cost. But that's an either or I don't accept. We have to find a way to be environmentally friendly. And to pretend that oil independence and energy independence means anything is absurd. The very fact that the XL pipeline is saying we're going to take dirty oil from Canada and take it through the United States. Most of it won't stay here. It will go somewhere else. But we're kind of saying that's the solution to energy dependency, is to take Canadian oil, dirty Canadian oil. What? You don't get that. The fact, it's like the people who say buy American because Chevy is an American brand even though it's made somewhere else. The world is interdependent. On all energy resources are interdependent. And the grid we make is with steel wires and lines and aluminum from somewhere else. There's no way this country ever again is going to be the early 19th century where we tap our own resources, make our own goods, and do it. It's not going to happen. We're way beyond that. But we somehow pretend in the sovereign politics of an independent nation that we can do that. And the politicians, frankly, tell lies to the American people about that. Because I don't care where the oil or the energy comes from, it will be interdependent. You like solar? That's great. The silicon doesn't come from the United States. It's coming from somewhere else. We're going to be dependent on someone else's silicon. So the turbines, they're being made in China and Germany. Texas has a pretty good shot at it too, but a lot of those turbines for wind energy that we all love, if we're environmentalists, are coming from somewhere else. So we live in an interdependent world. And it would be just as foolish to say, down here in Tampa, we're sick of Florida. We're just going to make Tampa do things its own way. We're not going to be dependent on anyone else. We're going to make everything and get our own foodstuffs and energy from Tampa. That would be absurd. But it's equally absurd to say the United States can do it. Interdependence is a reality, and once we recognize it, we can begin to solve problems, whereas when we don't, we actually create a deep hole out of which it will, in time, be impossible to climb. Who else? We're going to have just a couple more, and then we'll...
My name is David Outlaw. I'm a local manufacturer.
You say again?
Last name is Outlaw, just like it sounds.
Oh, okay.
I'm ethical, though. Okay? However, what I would like to say is I'm not here for questions. I'm going to give you some answers, because I've been looking at this, and I wouldn't be here if I thought the world was ethical. There would be no reason for it. Democracy is the same way. The world is not ethical. Okay? We need to get over that. We've got a couple things going on. I've had to shut down 3 plants in my local community. I had to give people their jobs to somewhere else. Is that right? Is that ethical? Okay, here's what happened. I'm going to tell you this in a way, in a short period, and you can answer back and forth, but what happened was we had all of our jobs taken from us from pegging the currency to China. That was not ethical, but it was done, and it's okay. I can't compete. That's 8 times the ratio of $1 to theirs. I don't have any problem with Chinese people. They're great people. I lived in China for 2 years. It was great. Let me say this. When you are playing on an uneven field, and we talk about this uneven field and the money that is no longer the same value here as it is there, you can't compete. Now, where I'm at now, tomorrow I'll be meeting with another group of manufacturers in the area that we're trying to get together and say, what happened to our jobs? How can we get them back? How can we talk to the politicians? What can we do? And you're absolutely right. This is a democracy. When we come in and we look at this, I'm saying, okay, who's to blame? Is it the politician? Is it the unethical people out there? Or is it us? Because we won't do something. We have the right to vote. And we can vote, and we can put whoever we want in office if we understand what the problem is. The issues now are the manufacturers have closed. We were taxed at 40% of our profits, which came and gave all the money to the government to do what we wanted to do. Now, all those manufacturers are gone, and so is the tax base. Can we do something? I don't know. So,
well, thanks for that. Thanks for that, and that's very important, and that speaks from your own work experience, and that really is important to know that this is not just a theory, but it's what you deal with and what you're trying to do. But you see, here's the thing about that. And you notice I haven't, even though I know this is the ethics forum, I hope you notice I haven't used the word ethics this evening, and that's on purpose. In fact, I said I'm trying to talk realism. I'm talking about the real world we live in. I'm not saying do stuff because it's ethical or because it feels nice. I'm saying there's certain changes we have to do because we won't survive if we don't. I'm talking about necessity. I'm talking about realism. And your point is exactly the right one, because right now, the U.S. cannot compete with manufacturing elsewhere in the world, not because we don't have good workers, educated workers, not because we don't have good technology and good plants, but because we can't compete with people who don't have the same safety standards that we have. We can't compete with people who are willing to use 12-year-old kids and pay them $1 an hour. We can't compete with people whose labor standards are so low that, say, in China, they bring whole villages from the east to the west coast and put them to work to build buildings at 50 cents an hour, and they sleep in slums. We can't compete with people, as Steve Jobs would tell you, who in Foxconn plant in China put dormitories of workers right next to the thing and wake them up in the middle of the night and say, okay, work now for 48 hours because we need X number of glass screens for the new iPods. We can't compete with that. And we can't compete with that because we live in an uneven world. But the world is uneven because markets go everywhere, jobs go everywhere, but there are no common standards, there's no common democracy, there are no common wages. But that's not an argument for, coming back. That's an argument for trying to find ways to develop common standards, common wages, common attitudes toward children. The English had the same problem in the 19th century. English manufacturers said, you can't expect us not to use 12-year-old girls in our mills in Manchester, when over on the continent they're doing that. We can't compete with them unless we have that cheap labor. And it wasn't until there were common standards that children weren't being used anywhere that you could do very much about it. And even in the United States we have a problem, because in some of our southern states down this way, things are a little different than in the north. And for a while, a lot of industry was migrating south because they had laws that allowed you not to have union organizations and so on. And that meant, was in the north, people said, we're trying to be decent and just and have unions and give fair wages, but we can't compete. And not until you have common standards. So the real response is, I am saying precisely we need interdependent democracy, interdependent citizenship, and interdependent regulations and standards in order to equalize the playing field. Does that mean that wages in China will be identical to ours? Of course not. They're a developing country, but there don't have to be the wild discrepancies. Does that mean that maybe they will have the same labor laws with respect to 60-year-olds that we have? Probably not, but at least we can keep 12 and 14-year-olds out, both for the sake of their kids and for the sake of our capacity to compete. So again, there is, I think, common ground, but to do it, you have to have institutions that work across borders. And by the way, the big corporations have found ways to do it. The International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, they make plenty of international regulations that work just great for the big corporations, but work lousy for firms like yours that are trying to keep the work here and provide jobs here. And you know, what we don't have is the equivalent for the kind of business you do where the same standards are applied. So what I'm arguing for here is that we need to think globally about the solutions, because the challenges we face and that you're having to deal with and having a very hard time figuring out how to do it, as I don't think it has anything to do with ethics. It has to do with how you can make a living and how you can make your business work in a world which is so uneven, and when there's so many different ways of doing things, and where people elsewhere are permitted to play with a currency, basically use semi-slave labor, basically completely eliminate fair working conditions, use child labor, and then you're supposed to go in there and compete with that. And naturally, you want to stay here, but at some point you say to yourself, God, if I'm going to stay in business, I better go over there and do the same thing everybody else is doing. So that's exactly right. But the solution to that is to democratize our global institutions and to globalize our democratic institutions in a way that the playing field becomes global. Right now, the international economy is a race to the bottom. The guys who manipulate the most, who are the least ethical, who have the lowest standards for safety and children and environmental, they win the game because they can have the lowest prices. And they price everybody else out of the market. And in order to do business globally, we need a semi-fair playing field. It's not going to be identical because there are different standards, different countries, there are different stages of development. But it's got to be somewhat common. And to do that, we have to think about global citizenship and global democracy and global standards that force others to, in effect, compete with us in a semi-fair way. I think if that happened, it sounds like with the ideals you have and what you're trying to do, you could probably not just stay in business, but stay in business pretty successfully. One more question. Is there one more? Who's got the mic? All right, this will be the, thank you. I know it's been a long evening. You're very kind to stay in it, but we'll stop right at 8 o'clock.
Mary Ann Kirk, Seminole. I just can't picture myself looking at the people in the Maldives Islands while their property is shrinking under the water and they're disappearing from the planet of the earth, and that I say, well, you just got to compromise. And how would you do it? How would you speak to them and say, compromise while all your culture, all your land, all your history is sinking under the ground? And it's going to happen here in Florida, too. So how would you speak to them?
That's a wonderful question and a good question to end on, and it allows me to maybe clarify what I mean by compromise. Someone who's about to die can't say, all right, let's each cut our nutrition by 10% to save the world's resources a little bit. Because a rich man cuts his nutrition by 10% and he's a little less overweight than he was before. The poor man cuts his nutrition 10%, he's dead. Global warming in the Maldives and a series of other areas, the floodplains around Bangladesh, the floodplains around the Netherlands, the floodplains in Indonesia, means death to that whole society. So I don't mean to say that therefore we should get together with the Bangladeshis and say, well, we'll cut our emissions a little so that the Bangladeshi floodplains will not be flooded until 5 years instead of in 2 years. That's not a compromise. I mean, that's not what compromise is. Remember, the other word I used with compromise was common ground. And to take your metaphor, common ground means solid ground. Common ground doesn't mean yours gets flooded and mine doesn't. And here is the fundamental issue that maybe we can end with and think about is inequality. Democracy works only when you have relative equality. You don't need people all to be making $100,000 a year. Some can make $200,000, $500,000, $1 million, and others can make $40,000. I don't think democracy works where some people make $2,000 a year and some people make $100 million a year. It just doesn't work. Maybe the guys earned the $100 million, I don't know, and maybe the one with $2,000 is a lazy good for nothing and doesn't deserve any more. But democracy doesn't work. You can't make democracy work with deep inequality. Democracy doesn't work, the art of compromise doesn't work if you're saying to somebody, you may lose your land literally underwater if you make the compromise we insist you make. That's not what we're, the compromise is about understanding where the other person is. And one of the problems with global climate change and a lot of the other issues we are looking at is that in the world we live in, the poor always pay the highest price. Women and children always pay the highest price for the conflicts we have and even sometimes the compromises we make. I have a bad joke. My wife doesn't like it, but my joke is that most Americans know what they'll do if there's climate change and the oceans are raised. They'll sell their homes in St. Pete and Long Island, and they'll move to Aspen. People with money don't have much of a problem with climate change short term. But it's a little like also New Orleans. New Orleans was a disaster for everyone in New Orleans, but it was a much greater disaster for those who didn't have cars to get out and couldn't get on the buses. They paid with their lives. Others lost their home, they lost their background. It was terrible, but it's a very different thing. They got out. So the costs to different people around the world of the various problems we face is very, very different. And when we talk about a politics, it has to be a politics that recognizes that, which is why I believe the first aim of any democratic politics is not to create perfect equality, but to create a diminution of inequality such that we all have the wherewithal to deal with potential disasters. The Maldives should not be in the position of disappearing if the climate change people are right and the skeptics are wrong and the oceans really do rise. They shouldn't lose their whole country. So that has to be a different perspective. So compromise doesn't simply mean you take half, I'll take half, but at the end of it you're dead and I'm not. Compromise means common ground, means understanding others, and that only works with relative equality. And that's why I think the biggest problem this country has faced, and maybe that's some of the reason we get all this incivility now, is that in 1970 or so, this country had more equality than ever before in its history. For whites and blacks, for Spanish, for whites and whites. Most Americans were pretty well off, and in the next years, an awful lot of Latinos and African Americans were able to buy homes. I don't know if you know this, but in the time since 2008, not only have 5 million people lost their homes, but an awful lot of those people are poor whites, poor Latinos, and poor blacks. Blacks and Latinos have lost 66% of their wealth in that time, because their wealth was in houses. They didn't have stocks, they didn't have bank accounts, they had property. And when those properties went dead, when they defaulted, they lost most of their wealth. And as a result, there's a big sudden fall again in the inequality between whites and blacks in this country because of the banking crisis. Inequality around the world is growing too. It's getting worse. For a long time it was getting better, now it's getting worse. It's getting worse between middle class and poor and between middle class and rich. The rich are getting much richer and putting a big gap between themselves and the rest of us, but the poor are also getting poorer and putting a gap between themselves and the rest of us. 2,500 years ago, Aristotle, the first great political thinker, said, if you have a society in which there are very rich and very poor and very little in the middle, it's not going to last. It'll fall apart in civil war, in revolution, in anger. You need a relatively large middle with small things on either side. We're getting bigger and bigger. A lot of money on one side, a lot of poor on the other, a rather uncertain middle class fearing for its future in the middle. That's a recipe for instability and the death of democracy. So if you want to take all these issues, you mentioned one, there are a lot of issues we can talk about. But the issue I'd want to talk about, first of all, and that's, I think, what Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party are both pointing to. They're both saying, talk about inequality. Because inequality is really going to ruin our democracy. It's going to make common ground impossible. It's going to make compromise impossible. It's going to destabilize our lives. We've got to equalize, and the gentleman over there was talking about a different kind of equality, equality across nations. We need more of an equal playing field. Then we can have the debates. Then we can find the common ground. But right now there are forces that seem to be working for even more inequality and saying inequality is fine, don't worry about it. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, it's therefore fall. 1 out of 4 American children live under the poverty line. 1 out of 4 American children live under the poverty line. And Maybe poverty is the fault of lazy, good-for-nothing people who are 30 or 40. I don't know any 2-year-old who's responsible for his or her own poverty. It's not their fault. And a country in which 1 out of 4 are living under the poverty line is not a country which bodes well for democracy 20 years from now when those kids grow up. So we have to think about those issues and how we deal with them. And again, as citizens, maybe that's the first thing that we ought to be doing, so that the scenario you described for us, one in which the people of the Maldives have to bargain away their very existence with respect to global warming, will not come to pass, and which America can have everybody involved in the debate. The very poor are never involved in the debate. They can't be citizens. If you're worried about where your next fix is coming from, your next dollar is coming from, your next food stamp is coming from, your next job is coming from, and you have no idea, you're really not going to be much in the way of a citizen. So we've got to get to a minimum threshold where we can all be citizens, and then we can have those discussions and so on. But it means that the people in the discussion won't put on the table their very lives as the bet that they're making. And so let's maybe bring this to conclusion by saying citizenship, yes, we have the power, but we better start by creating more equality again in this country and getting everybody back into citizenship. Because right now I'm calling for American citizens to be citizens of the world, but there are a lot of Americans who are not yet citizens. And I don't just mean undocumented workers, I mean Americans born here who don't enjoy any of the capacities of citizenship. And we need them, not just for their sake, but for ours, because without them, we won't make it. Well, thank you for an enlivening discussion. It's been great. Thank you.
I hate to be the one to break this up. I have a feeling we could stay here another hour or more, but we do want to be respectful of your time and your schedules. And I just want to say thank you, Dr. Barber, for making this one of the best evenings that I've had in a long time, and I hope the rest of you who are here. You have given us a great deal to think about as we prepare as citizens of this country to do our civic duty and privilege of electing our national leaders in a few months. And you've certainly given us a lot to think about to prepare for that. And I would like to ask for another round of applause for our speakers. And I just want to close by inviting everyone to notice our upcoming events on March 14th at 9:30 a.m., a morning event. We will co-sponsor a forum entitled Keeping the Faith at the Ballot Box. That will be here in this auditorium. It's an interfaith discussion of the influence of faith upon our votes. And on March 21st, also in this room at 6 p.m., the second part of our three-part energy series, this one focusing on the role of renewables and conservation in our energy future. That's all for tonight. Thank everyone and have a safe trip home.